The laughter came the moment Travis Hale stepped out of his dust-covered Ford pickup and into the most exclusive automotive auction New York had hosted in a decade. Valets in pressed white gloves exchanged glances. Men in tailored suits turned their heads. Women draped in jewelry paused mid-conversation. A young attendant stepped forward and asked with barely concealed disbelief, "Sir, are you lost?" On the elevated stage above the showroom floor, CEO Rebecca Vaughn caught sight of the faded denim jacket and worn work boots, and she let out a short, dismissive laugh directly in front of the assembled cameras. "This auction is for serious collectors," she said, loud enough for the nearest rows to hear clearly. The entire room laughed with her. But minutes later, when the rarest Ferrari of the evening rolled under the spotlights and Travis raised his paddle for the very first time, every billionaire in that room began to sweat. What would silence Rebecca Vaughn completely that night was not the number Travis paid. It was the reason he bought every single car in the room. The Meridian Supercar auction had been billed as the most significant automotive event of the year, held inside a converted warehouse on the western edge of Manhattan that had been transformed for one evening into something closely resembling a cathedral of carbon fiber and hand-polished chrome. The invitation list read like a careful compilation of American wealth in its most concentrated and curated form. Hedge fund managers from Greenwich, technology founders who had cashed out at precisely the right moment, real estate magnates from both coasts, and a small delegation of international collectors who had flown in specifically for 3 Ferrari lots that had not been publicly available in over 15 years. Catering staff moved through the crowd carrying flutes of champagne and small plates of things that no one actually ate. The lighting was warm and golden, the kind that made every polished hood and custom lacquer coat look as though it had been arranged for a magazine spread. On a raised platform near the center of the floor, a 1990 Ferrari F40 in a shade of red that was custom mixed, and not a factory standard, sat behind a rope of brushed velvet. A small placard in front of it that read, "Estimated value, $4 million." This was not a simple transaction. It was a performance. And every person in that room, from the first-time bidder to the veteran collector with 6 prior Meridian paddles mounted on his office wall, understood their assigned role in it completely. Rebecca Vaughn had co-organized the event through her firm, Vaughn Prestige Group, a luxury brand consulting and high-end event production company that had spent the better part of a decade positioning itself as the definitive authority on aspirational living across the northeastern United States. She was 41 years old, dressed in a black cocktail gown that had cost more than most people's monthly take-home salaries, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that came not merely from financial success, but from years of calibrated public appearances and carefully engineered first impressions. She was finishing a quote for a business journalist near the entrance corridor when her security director, Nolan, caught her eye from across the room with the particular expression that meant something required her attention. She finished her sentence without rushing, handed her champagne flute to an assistant, and turned toward the main entrance, where a dust-covered 1993 Ford F-150 had just pulled up between a midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantom and a matte black Bugatti Chiron, its right rear quarter panel showing the kind of rust that develops when a truck has spent decades working outdoors rather than being stored. The man who climbed out of it was somewhere in his early 40s, broad-shouldered and unhurried, wearing a faded denim jacket over a plain gray shirt. His boots were worn through at the toe. His watch was unremarkable. He looked, in the collective estimation of nearly everyone who saw him step through those glass doors, exactly like a man who had taken a wrong exit off the highway and wandered into the wrong building. Travis Hale did not look around the room the way everyone else did. He did not reach for the nearest glass of champagne. He did not pull out a phone to photograph the cars on display, which was what most first-time attendees did within 30 seconds of walking through the door. He moved slowly along the perimeter of the showroom floor with his hands relaxed at his sides, and he looked at the vehicles the way a person looks at a photograph they have not seen in a very long time, not with the acquisitive hunger of a collector cataloging targets, and not with the detached calculation of a buyer running return on investment scenarios in real time. He looked at them with the quality of attention that belongs to someone who already knows what they are looking at by heart and has chosen to remember it rather than discover it for the first time. When his gaze reached the Ferrari F40 on its raised platform near the center of the floor, something in his posture changed almost imperceptibly. A slight stillness, a breath held precisely a half-second longer than usual. No one in the room noticed it. Every person in the room was too busy noticing his truck. Nolan intercepted him near the edge of the VIP cordon before Travis had made it halfway across the floor. The security director was polished and professional in exactly the manner that expensive venues train their staff to be, cool and composed, never outwardly hostile, but unmistakably firm in the way that people are firm when they believe they already know the outcome of a situation. He asked for the invitation in a tone that was already certain one would not be produced. Travis reached into the inside pocket of his denim jacket and drew out an envelope, matte black, heavyweight stock, gold embossed at the lower corner, the kind issued exclusively to the top tier of confirmed bidders, the ones the auction house had personally vetted and cleared through their private banking channel months in advance. Nolan examined it with a slight narrowing of the eyes, turning it once, and before he could speak again, Rebecca Vaughn had arrived at his shoulder. She looked at Travis. She looked at the envelope. She tilted her head in the precise way that people tilt their heads when they have already decided not to believe something, and she said, with the particular sweetness that is not sweet at all, "This isn't a public car show." The implication was delivered cleanly and without ambiguity. The envelope was either borrowed from someone who was no longer present or produced through means she preferred not to examine too closely because the man holding it did not match the room's expectations, and in Rebecca's years of curating rooms like this one, that had always been sufficient grounds for a conclusion. Travis did not raise his voice. He did not flush or shift his weight or do any of the small, involuntary things that people do when they feel outmaneuvered and want to prove they belong somewhere. He extended the envelope slightly further and waited with the patience of someone who had made a decision and was simply allowing events to catch up to it. It was Dean Carver who broke the standoff. Dean, one of the evening's most prominent bidders, a 48-year-old private equity executive who had spent the last 3 years using high-profile automotive auctions as both a personal hobby and a very deliberate exercise in public brand management. He appeared at Rebecca's left elbow with a drink in one hand and a smirk already assembled, and he said, loud enough to carry clearly across the nearest 20 feet of immaculate poured concrete floor, "Maybe he wants a selfie with the Ferrari." The laughter that spread through the nearest cluster of guests was not the cruel laughter of a deliberate attack. It was the kind of laughter that forms when a roomful of people decide, collectively and without discussing it, that something is beneath serious consideration, and that particular quality of dismissal, the casual and collective kind, carries a weight that deliberate cruelty rarely matches. Rebecca smiled. She turned to Nolan. She said quietly but with complete clarity, "Escort him out." Travis looked at her as she said it. He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, like a man who had just received a confirmation he had already half expected, and who was now deciding what to do with it. The auction formally opened at 8 o'clock with brief remarks from the evening's host, Grant Holloway. a well-known automotive journalist who had spent 30 years turning a genuine love of machinery into a career that suited him completely. He walked the crowd through the provenance of the evening's most significant lots with practiced enthusiasm and real knowledge. And the room settled into the specific, humming attentiveness of a crowd that has assembled for something it believes will be worth its time. The first several lots moved quickly and cleanly. A 1968 Shelby Cobra in Guardsman Blue, with its matching numbers drivetrain documented back to the original build, a 1984 Porsche 911 Carrera in slate gray with its full-service history intact, and a limited edition McLaren with a verifiable racing heritage that drew a phone bidder from overseas who stayed competitive through 4 rounds before dropping at $2.1 million. The bidding was aggressive, and the prices were consequential, and the room had the particular energy of a space where large numbers are spoken aloud without flinching, where the act of raising a paddle carries more social weight than the number itself. Travis Hale, who had not in fact been removed from the premises, the auction house's head of guest relations, had quietly intervened after Nolan verified the black envelope's legitimacy with the Home Office and discovered that the banking institution backing the account was not a regional firm, had positioned himself near the back of the standing area, a plastic cup of water in one hand, paddle resting against his thigh, watching everything and saying nothing. When Grant Holloway introduced the Ferrari F40, the room's attention sharpened in a way that was perceptibly different from every prior lot. The F40 was presented with the reverence that automotive people reserve for machinery they regard as genuinely and irreplaceably significant. A production run of fewer than 1,300 examples, the last car personally approved by Enzo Ferrari before his death. A machine that represented the absolute convergence of racing technology and road legal engineering at the point in history when those two categories were closest to each other. Grant moved through the specifications with precision and care, and then made a passing comment about the engine's twin-turbo configuration that contained a small, technical, easily overlooked error. A detail about the specific intercooler placement used in the early production run that was accurate for the 1989 pre-production specification, but not for the 1990 build year documented on this particular car's certification. It was the kind of error that 99% of the room would absorb without registering it as an error at all. Travis Hale said, not loudly but not quietly either, "That's the 89 pre-production spec." The 90 build ran a revised manifold layout. He was not performing. He was not making a point to anyone in particular. He was simply correcting an inaccuracy the way a person corrects something when accuracy matters to them as a matter of habit. Claire Ashworth, the auction house's chief provenance researcher, was standing approximately 2 feet to his left, and she heard every word. She turned and looked at him, at the cup of water, at the worn boots, at the paddle resting against his leg, and she did not look away for a long moment. The Ferrari sat under the gallery lights while the opening bids were announced, and Travis stood at the back of the room and looked at it in a manner that Claire found difficult to classify professionally, because in 14 years of working auction rooms, she had developed a precise vocabulary for the way buyers looked at cars, and this did not fit any category in it. It was not the expression of someone calculating value. It was not performance, and it was not nostalgia in the generic sense. It was the expression of someone who recognized what they were looking at from the inside, not as an observer of the car's history, but as a participant in it. The particular shade of red on that body was a custom formulation, not a Ferrari factory standard, mixed to a specification that had been decided not by a manufacturer, but by 2 people standing in a garage in upstate New York, who had spent 11 months taking that car apart and reassembling it by hand, learning every mechanical idiosyncrasy and structural decision in the process, because they had chosen to spend that time together doing exactly that. Travis Hale had been one of those two people. His wife, Mara, had been the other. He had not seen this car in 7 years. Dean Carver opened the bidding on the Ferrari at $1.2 million, which drew a murmur of approval from the crowd. Not because it was a surprising number, but because it established immediately that Dean intended to win and had prepared accordingly. 2 other bidders entered in quick succession. A Texas oil executive named Marcus Webb, known for winning by sustained patience rather than aggressive early escalation, and a European collector represented by a phone bidder whose identity the auction house had agreed not to disclose. The number climbed in deliberate increments, 1.5 million, 2 million, 2.4, with the rhythm of people who understand that large bids made too quickly communicate desperation rather than strength. The phone bidder withdrew at 2.7. Marcus Webb held his position through 3 million and then paused, recalculating. Dean came in at 3.2. Marcus set his paddle down. The room began to organize itself around Dean as the presumptive winner, and a low murmur of premature congratulation began forming at the edges of the crowd. The particular sound of a room deciding that a narrative has concluded before the final line has been delivered. Travis Hale raised his paddle for the first time. He did not stand. He did not make a production of it. He raised the paddle from his position at the back of the standing area with the same unhurried motion he had used for everything else that evening, and he said, calmly and without any inflection of performance, 5 million. The room's response was not immediate. There was a half-second delay, the precise interval that passes when a brain receives information and takes an additional moment to confirm it has processed correctly, and then the silence arrived. Not the transitional silence between competing bids, but the dense, full-room silence of suspended collective breath. $5 million on a single car. From the man in the denim jacket who had been dismissed at the door less than an hour before. Grant Holloway repeated the number without any change in his professional delivery. $5 million. Do I hear 5.5? No one answered. No paddle moved. The gavel came down, and Travis Hale had just purchased the Ferrari F40 that he and his late wife had spent 11 months rebuilding together in a garage in upstate New York. 7 years after circumstances he had never fully accepted had carried it out of his life. Rebecca Vaughn was moving before the sound of the gavel had fully cleared. She intercepted her operations director at the side of the stage and spoke quickly and quietly. She wanted financial verification on the bidder before the lot was formally closed. She wanted the paddle number cross-referenced against the guest account. She wanted confirmation of identity and asset backing before any paperwork moved forward. Her operations director understood that this was not standard procedure, that applying it selectively to one bidder in a room that contained 40 others who had spent more than $1 million without verification was the precise category of action that created legal exposure. But he also understood the particular register in which Rebecca spoke when she had made a decision, and that the correct response in that register was not, "Are you certain?" He placed the call to the auction house's banking partner. The confirmation returned in under 4 minutes. The liquid assets on deposit under the name Travis Hale exceeded the combined verified net worth of every active bidder in the room. The operations director passed his tablet to Rebecca. She read the number twice without speaking. Across the room, Dean Carver had been watching her face with the practiced attention of a man who had spent 20 years reading rooms for a living, and this was the first time all evening that he had seen Rebecca Vaughn look genuinely uncertain about something. The 4 lots that followed settled into a pattern that the room took several rounds to recognize clearly, and then could not stop watching. A 1965 Shelby Cobra 327, one of the rarest American road cars of its era. Dean opened at $1.8 million pushed through 2.5 with the focused aggression of someone correcting a mistake, and was stopped entirely at 3.8 by a single clean bid from Travis that landed with no room left for a counter. A 1997 McLaren F1, one of 64 road specification examples ever manufactured, which the phone bidder re-entered to contest with genuine commitment. Travis won it at $7.2 million after an exchange that lasted less than 90 seconds, the phone bidder withdrawing when it became apparent that the man at the back of the room had no visible ceiling. A 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera RS, a car so historically documented and motorsport significant that two separate buyers had flown in from Europe specifically for this single lot. Travis took it at $2.9 million on his second bid without any change in his posture or expression. Dean Carver entered each of these contests. He raised his paddle each time with the competitive instinct of a man who was not accustomed to being outbid in a room he had prepared for. He did not win any of them. The dollar amounts he had committed to failed bids were climbing into territory that had not been in his planning. By the fourth lot, the expression on his face had traveled a considerable distance from competitive to something that looked, in unguarded moments, almost like confusion. What the room could not reconcile, and what began generating its own quiet current of conversation along the seated rows, was the way Travis behaved during every one of these transactions. He did not lean forward when bidding climbed. He did not check the numbers on the display board with the vigilance of someone calculating exposure in real time. He watched the cars. Each time a new vehicle came onto the floor, he looked at it with the same quality of attention Claire Ashworth had noticed from the start. That specific stillness, that unhurried and private quality of recognition, as though each car were returning something to him rather than presenting itself for acquisition. Claire, who was professionally trained not to make assumptions before she had documentation, had not returned to her workstation. She remained in the standing area at the back of the room, close enough to observe, taking no notes and making no calls, doing the thing that her 14 years in provenance research had made her best at. Watching carefully and understanding before anyone else in the room had assembled enough pieces to see what the complete picture was. Claire had spent 14 years in automotive provenance, which meant 14 years of learning that the most important facts about a car were rarely the ones recorded in its paperwork. She pulled up the bidder profile on her tablet while the sixth lot was being previewed on stage and found what the auction house had on file. A name, a verified account backed by a private banking institution in Burlington, Vermont, and a contact address in a rural county north of Montpelier. Very little else. The name, however, was sufficient. She entered it into a separate search alongside the phrase Hail Dynamics. Two words she had encountered once, years earlier, in a technical reference paper on aftermarket performance engineering, and what came back stopped her mid-scroll in a way that had not happened to her professionally in several years. Hail Dynamics had operated for 12 years, from 2000 to 2012, out of 2 facilities in Vermont, and had employed, at its peak, fewer than 30 people. What those 30 people had produced during that period had been assessed by the engineering departments of 3 of the world's largest automotive manufacturers as work that was substantively ahead of what their own in-house teams were developing contemporaneously. A variable compression management system developed by Hail Dynamics in 2008 had been licensed and quietly incorporated into production engine platforms by 2 major European manufacturers under a licensing agreement that, by terms of the contract, required no attribution. The founder of Hail Dynamics, its lead design engineer, and the person who had, by multiple industry accounts, been the primary technical intelligence behind its most significant work, was a man named Travis Hale. He had sold the company in 2013. Not in stages, not through a structured exit with earnouts and transition periods. He had liquidated it completely and cleanly, converted the assets to cash, and withdrawn from the industry so thoroughly that people who had worked with him professionally had described the disappearance as either the most admirably decisive thing they had ever witnessed or the most disturbing, depending on their relationship with him. The reason, which Claire found referenced in a single brief entry in a Vermont County newspaper archive, was the death of his wife. Mara Hale had died in the spring of 2013 after a long illness. She had been 37 years old. She and Travis had built Hale Dynamics together. She had managed the business operations and client relationships while he ran the engineering and design, and by multiple accounts from former employees who had given interviews to automotive publications. In the years after the company dissolved, the company had functioned as an extension of their partnership as much as it had functioned as a commercial enterprise. After Mara died, Travis had sold everything, withdrawn his daughter from her school, and moved to a property in the Vermont hills with no public presence and no traceable professional activity. He had been there, as far as anyone could determine, for the 11 years since. Claire set down her tablet and looked across the room at the man in the denim jacket who had just paid $7.2 million for a McLaren without altering his expression by a measurable degree. What struck Claire most forcefully in the final accounting, however, was not the biography. It was the cars themselves. As she worked backward through the lot histories with the knowledge of who Travis Hale actually was, a pattern emerged that should have been legible earlier, but had been obscured by the layered complexity of multi-year provenance chains. 6 of the 12 vehicles in the evening's auction, not all 12, but 6, had passed through ownership or restoration documentation that, when traced with proper diligence, connected at some point to either Hale Dynamics or to Travis Hale in a personal capacity. The Shelby Cobra had been restored in a facility sharing a physical address with Hale Dynamics' former Vermont satellite operation. The Bugatti Veyron, scheduled for a later lot, had been sold at a private auction in 2015 through an estate executor whose listed legal representative matched the firm Travis had used for the Hale Dynamics liquidation. The Ferrari F40 on its platform in the center of the room had a restoration record signed by an independent technician, whose documented training and certification traced back to a 2-year apprenticeship at the original Hale Dynamics facility in Burlington. These were not coincidental overlaps in a fragmented market. They were the residue of a dispersal, a collection assembled over years with great intentionality, broken apart by the specific gravity of loss and legal and financial events that had moved during the worst period of a man's life. Its pieces distributed across nearly a decade of subsequent transactions, each one traveling incrementally further from the place it had started. Travis Hale had not come to the Meridian Supercar auction to acquire cars. He had come to collect what had already been his. Rebecca Vaughn became aware that the room had changed around her the way a person becomes aware of weather shifting, not through a single clear signal, but through an accumulation of small ones that suddenly cohere into a pattern with an obvious shape. The murmuring at the room's edges had altered in character. It was no longer the competitive chatter of bidders recalibrating strategies in real time, but the lower, more concentrated sound of people exchanging information they found genuinely significant. She caught the phrase Hale Dynamics spoken twice within the same 3-minute window from 2 different directions. She observed 2 of her media contacts near the rear of the room working their phones with the focused urgency of journalists who had just received a tip they believed was worth moving quickly on. She looked at the stage. She looked at the lot number on the display board. She looked at Travis Hale standing at the back of the room with his water cup and his paddle against the wall, and she felt, with the sudden, unambiguous clarity of someone who has just understood the difference between what they believed they were managing and what was actually happening, that she had read this situation badly from the beginning, and that the full weight of that misreading had not yet finished arriving. Dean Carver materialized at her elbow with the energy of a man who needed urgently to reframe the evening on terms that still favored him. He had spent the auction committing more capital than he had planned to 2 successful lots, and losing considerably more in contests he had entered with confidence and exited with nothing. "Money can't buy class," he said, with the particular laugh of someone who believes the statement more seriously than they are willing to admit aloud, and who is testing how it lands before deciding how hard to commit to it. He said it at a volume calibrated to carry to the people closest to them. Travis Hale, positioned 8 feet away, turned his head. He looked at Dean with the measured attention of someone determining whether a response was worth the energy required to deliver it. And then he said, without heat and without any theatrical weight at all, "Neither can arrogance." The words settled into the nearest pocket of quiet with the precision of something that had been thought through long before it was spoken, not improvised, not performed, just stated. Dean opened his mouth. He did not produce a follow-up. 3 of the people who had heard the exchange found somewhere else to direct their gaze. Rebecca Vaughn stood very still beside her security director, holding her paddle and looking at a man she had dismissed at the door of her own event with the first clear awareness that she had made a significant and public error of judgment, and that the error was still unfolding. The final lot of the Meridian Supercar auction had been structured differently from every lot preceding it. Rather than presenting the remaining 8 vehicles individually, the auction house offered them as a single consolidated collection, to be purchased by one buyer, transported together, and kept intact as a unified holding, a condition inserted into the sale terms at the explicit request of the anonymous private seller who had consigned them. The collection comprised the second Ferrari lot, a Bugatti Veyron Supersport finished in a 2-tone that was one of 3 examples with that specific specification, a limited production Lamborghini Miura that had not appeared at public auction in over 12 years, and 5 additional vehicles whose combined individual market values placed the aggregate estimate at $150 million. Rebecca had pre-cleared a ceiling of $85 million with her financial advisory team 3 weeks before the event. She had specifically arranged with 2 attending journalists to be positioned near the stage when the final lot opened. She had, with the thoroughness and discipline she applied to every public-facing element of her professional life, planned exactly how this part of the evening was meant to look. The raised paddle, the committed number, the photographs of Vaughn Prestige Group operating at this altitude of the market. Grant Holloway opened the lot with an introduction that ran longer and more reverentially than anything else in the evening. He described the collection as something that could not be assembled again. Vehicles spanning 6 decades of automotive development, 3 continents of manufacturing tradition, and a racing heritage whose documentation was, in his professional assessment, singular. The room's attention was total and unhurried. The opening bid was set at $90 million. Rebecca's hand moved toward her paddle. Before she could raise it, Travis Hale stood up. It was the first time in the entire evening that he had risen from his position at the back of the standing area, and the act of simply standing, no paddle raised, no number stated, just a man in a denim jacket getting to his feet at the back of an auction room, drew a quality of attention that was measurably different from anything a bid number could produce. He raised his paddle. He said, in the same unhurried and unpracticed voice he had used for every transaction that night, $180 million. The silence that followed was not the transitional silence between competing bids. It was a complete silence, the kind that fills a room not with absence but with presence, the the collective suspension of an entire space processing something it did not anticipate. Grant Holloway held his gavel at the top of its arc for 4 full seconds. Rebecca Vaughn's hand, still holding the paddle she had not managed to raise, descended slowly back to her side. No counterbid followed. At $180 million in a room containing some of the most concentrated liquid private wealth on the East Coast, the auction was simply concluded. The gavel came down. Travis Hale sat back against the wall and set his paddle on the floor, with the unhurried finality of someone who was finished with a task, which he was. Rebecca Vaughn crossed the room to him in the 30 seconds between the gavel strike and the polite applause that filled the space after it. Not walking quickly, because walking quickly was not something she did in public, but with a directness that made her assistant take a small step backward rather than follow. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him with the same assessing gaze she had turned on him 4 hours earlier at the cordon, and she asked, not with cruelty this time, but with the genuine and unguarded incomprehension of someone who had spent an evening watching events that did not fit her categories. Why would you buy all of them? Travis looked at her. He looked at the stage, at the 8 covered vehicles being prepared for transfer processing. And then he said, quietly and with complete steadiness, because they were never supposed to be here. The full account came out in the hour that followed, not as a confrontation or a dramatic announcement, but as something quieter and considerably more disorienting. A sequence of documented facts that assembled themselves the way water assembles, patiently, and then all at once, into a picture whose dimensions were much larger than anyone in the room had been holding. Claire Ashworth laid her provenance research before the auction house's senior staff at a table near the back of the building. The story that emerged from that documentation was not complicated in its mechanics. In the years immediately following Mara Hale's death, the assets of Hale Dynamics had been liquidated in stages, some of those stages directed by Travis himself in a period of grief that had not afforded him the full coherence that calmer circumstances might have provided. But a portion of the personal collection, vehicles that he and Mara had built or fully restored together, machines that represented not financial portfolio but shared and irreplaceable history, had passed out of his possession through channels he had not controlled and in some cases had not known about until years after the fact. A storage facility in Rutland had auctioned its units following an unpaid invoice dispute that went unresolved during the worst months of his bereavement. Legal complications in the estate administration had resulted in several items being disposed of through a broker without his explicit authorization. Pieces of a life released into the collector market without consent, moving through subsequent transactions across years until they appeared in auction catalogs under other names and other provenance histories that were accurate in their chain of title and entirely silent on their origin. Travis had found the first of them by accident, 4 years after Mara died, while searching for unrelated documentation in an online lot archive for a small regional auction house in New Jersey. A Shelby Cobra with a restoration record signed in familiar handwriting. He had spent the 3 years after that discovery working through auction databases and private sale records with the same systematic precision he had once applied to engine diagnostics, identifying each piece of the dispersal, mapping its current position in the market, calculating the conditions under which it could be recovered. He had moved carefully and without urgency, because moving quickly would have driven prices up and created competitive dynamics that might scatter the vehicles further or permanently. He had let the market run. He had watched each piece move through its own trajectory, and when the Meridian auction had assembled 6 of the 12 remaining pieces in a single event, the largest single concentration of them in any one place since the dispersal began, he had registered as a bidder, driven down from Vermont in his 1993 Ford F-150, and written a check for $180 million. Claire, who was not by professional formation a person who experienced strong sentiment in auction settings, had to stop speaking at one point during her account and look at the table for a moment before continuing. Rebecca Vaughn stood through the whole of it without moving, and the expression on her face cycled through several things that did not have clean names. By 11 o'clock that night, the story had left the building. A journalist who had been in the room during the final lot, and who had been working his contacts since Dean Carver's comment, and Travis's reply, filed a piece that published before midnight with a headline that was accurate and clean and traveled fast. Single father purchases entire supercar collection at $180 million auction. The reporting that followed in the morning papers and industry publications added context that made the story considerably larger. An engineering prodigy who had walked away from a nine-figure industry to raise a child alone in rural Vermont, a collection assembled with a late wife over the course of a decade and scattered by the practical failures of grief, 7 years of patient and methodical recovery work, a room full of billionaires who had laughed at the man's truck. The coverage was thorough, and it was not charitable to Rebecca Vaughn, though it was fair in its way. It reported what had happened without embellishment, and what had happened was sufficient. Rebecca made no public statement that night. She did not issue a response the following morning. She called her assistant early, cleared 2 scheduled appearances, and asked for a car without specifying a destination. Travis Hale spent the morning after the auction at the document processing center of the Meridian Auction House, working through title transfer paperwork for $180 million worth of vehicles, with the methodical patience he applied to every task that required precision. He had produced reading glasses from his jacket pocket and was reviewing a stack of certification documents when Rebecca Vaughn arrived at the processing office at 10:30 in the morning. She had not called ahead. She sat down across the table from him without waiting to be invited. She did not have a prepared statement, and she did not attempt to construct one on the spot. She told him, simply and without qualification, that she was sorry for the dismissal at the cordon, for the instruction to Nolan, for the assumption she had made the moment she saw him step out of his truck and decided, on the basis of that single image, what he was and what he was not. Travis listened to all of it without interrupting. He did not tell her that it was fine, because it had not been fine, and he was not a man who said things he did not mean as a courtesy to other people's comfort. He also did not return what she had given him at the door of her own event, because he had nothing to gain from it and no interest in the practice. He set down his glasses and looked at her directly and said, "You saw an old truck and decided my worth." It was not an accusation delivered in anger. It was a statement delivered in the clarity that belongs to someone who has had sufficient time to understand exactly what happened and exactly what it means, and who is choosing to say it plainly rather than dress it in something softer. Rebecca held his gaze. She had no answer that was proportionate to the observation. She nodded once, rose from the chair, and left without saying anything else. The transport convoy departed the Meridian loading facility that afternoon in the long amber light of a late spring evening over the Hudson River. 8 enclosed custom transport vehicles, the kind used to move machinery worth more than most commercial buildings, pulled out in formation behind a lead vehicle, heading north. At the very front of the procession, setting the pace, was a dust-covered 1993 Ford F-150, driven by a man in a faded denim jacket who had not looked at his phone once since the auction closed the previous night. The highway was mostly clear. The trailer doors caught the last direct light as the formation moved through the outskirts of the city and then into the open stretches of the thruway where the land opened up on both sides, and the sky held that particular quality of early evening that makes ordinary things briefly look like something larger. There was nothing about the truck at the front of that procession that announced what was traveling behind it. There was nothing about the man driving it that declared what he had done the night before, or what he had spent 7 years quietly doing before that, or what it meant to him that a red Ferrari with a custom paint formulation that existed in no factory catalog was for the first time since the winter of 2017 moving in the same direction he was moving, following him home. He drove at a speed that would not strain a 30-year-old suspension. The miles passed without ceremony, and the most valuable man in the room had been, as it turned out, the one nobody had thought to look at carefully.